That is a very important entry point for me to explain contagion. Okay, let's assume our country has relatively strong fundamentals. Any measure that you use, macro fundamentals, strong. Okay, our foreign reserve is relatively strong, credit growth is strong, real exchange rate is not appreciating. So let's assume that. Okay, and yet our country can still fall into crisis. So what happened there? Now, of course, there are many explanations why that happened, but one of the potential strong explanation is precisely the topic that we are discussing today, and that is contagion. So, in other words, it's like innocent bystander. So you're walking and you're not, making a wrong move and so forth. But just because your neighbor making a wrong move, you got the effect. So that is contagion. Okay. Now, logically, you can think of how to avoid that contagion. Okay. Can you think of if contagion is an additional source of crisis, then how to avoid that contagion? Because if the source of the weak fundamental is not in your country, but in other countries, how can you do with other countries? Because that's their sovereign, right? Is the case. It's almost like, this current virus, coronavirus. If you're healthy, if you're not having this coronavirus, but you're afraid to get the contagion from people who had the virus, right? What do you do?
I think what I would do as a policymaker is to close the capital inflow from those countries that are very vulnerable to crisis and all that.
That is called capital control. So the macroeconomic terms of what Christian said is called the capital control. Okay. But capital controls can have positive impact in that sense, right? To prevent you from getting the contagion. But at the same time, capital controls can be also bad because you need capital. So if you control, how do you, okay, let's say there are two types of capital. One is capital that is very contagious. It's imagine there's two types of virus. Okay, one is the deadly virus, the other one is social virus. How do you select? Don't let the deadly virus comes in, right? That's becoming the challenge here. The same analogy you can apply in macroeconomics. How can policymakers select only capital inflows that will be stable, that will have positive impact on our economy, okay, that will be allowed, but we don't allow or we try to minimize the dangerous component of capital inflows. So same analogy here. Okay, that is the real challenge here. Now, I'm going to explain later on in detail, but this is the most important rationale why we need the second topic of today, macro-prudential policy. So now I hope you understand why all of a sudden we talk about macro-prudential policy, why it's not enough to talk about macro policy, because this is a class about macroeconomics, right? Why all of a sudden we discuss about macro-prudential? This is why. Because when you open your economy, like our economy, okay, there is a risk that all kinds of flows, bad and good, comes to your country because you're open. That means there is a risk that you get the bad inflows. So how do you prevent that from happening? Meaning, how do you select those inflows? How do you accept only the good one, but prevent the bad one? The short answer is macro-prudential policy. Okay, so if you just want to understand the surface of the topic for today, that's it. So we can finish the course now, because I already explained to you the contagion, and I gave you the rationale for macroprudential policy. Okay, but of course, the next hour or so, I'm going to explain example and the mechanism. What is the difference between macroprudential policy and macro policy? Okay, but before I do that, any question? But so far, you follow what I was explaining here?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So far, I kind of follow.
Good, good. Yeah, this is the risk of teaching online, because I cannot really get the nuance from you, whether you really understand. I'm just looking at your face, and I'm not a psychologist, so I cannot judge by looking at your face whether you understand or not. So please respond, okay? Tell me, I understand, I don't understand, All right, so now let's...
Sir, can I ask?
Yes, please.
I was a bit wondering. Let's say if we want to, as a government, we want to analyze whether like a certain country is bringing a bad capital.
Yeah.
But to decide it, we basically need data or information from them.
Good.
But what if they are really restricted or closed, that they don't want to tell us the whole information? How do we make information? How can we make decision from that?
Yeah. Well, okay, the short answer is you cannot, because even if, let's say, the country, the origin country of the capital is very friendly with you, okay, even if that is the case, those country, the government in those country cannot control the capital owners in that country, because we are talking about private capital here. We are not talking about official capital. It's not money from the US government, money from Japanese government. No, because what we are talking about here is that private capital owned by private investors in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and so forth. Okay, so the answer is no, you cannot. Okay, so then what can you do then if you cannot sort of ask the other government to give the information? Macroprudential policy. That's why there's no other alternative, but you have to implement macroprudential policy. Okay, now of course many countries realize about this. Some country implement effectively, some country implement not effectively, and some country implement only slightly. Okay, and we will discuss about that later on when we reach that point. Okay, but am I answering your question? Okay. All right. Now,
Sir, one
yes,
question.
Please.
So, if one country is considered as the cause of some contagion for one country or another, is that country will always be the cause of contagion for other country? Let's say, for example, if Indonesia is the contagious for US, will Indonesia will always be a contagious for European country?
No. Okay. First of all, let me correct a little bit your statement. Don't say capital from that country. Capital from the private sectors in that country, because the risk is that if you said it's from that country, then it's like what Fabian questioned earlier. You think it's government of that country. No, it's not government. It's a private sector. It's investors. Okay. Now, if, let's say, a large amount of capital inflow in Indonesia coming from country A, for example, then yes, something happened between these two countries, then the risk of capital outflow from that country big, and the risk of affecting our economy is also big. But is it always like that? That always Indonesia vulnerable to country A? No, it's not, because capital inflow is coming from all over the world. It's not just from one country. Now, of course, rule of 101 is that it is better if the source of the capital inflow in our country is diverse. You don't want to rely on a major capital inflow only from one or two countries, right? So this is 101, diversification basically, so that you can reduce the risk here. Okay, but it's not always, Dava. It's not always. If we, let's say, the first crisis was caused by. In fact, it's interesting your question, because in 1997, why we fell into crisis, because most of the capital at that time are coming from Japan, not Japanese government, Japanese banks, because many of Indonesian conglomerate at that time borrow a heavy amount of money from the Japanese bank. Okay, whereas Korean crisis, many of the Korean chaebol is the same like conglomerates here. Many of the Korean chaebol borrow money from U.S. banks, not the U.S. government, U.S. banks, private sector actually. And I think I told you the story in this class, right? Why the recovery in Korea is V-shaped, ours is L-shaped, very long and so on. Because Japanese bank, which are Indonesian major lenders, at that time was also in trouble, so they could not reschedule the debt. So when the time Indonesia had to pay that foreign debt, our currency already depreciated, we cannot repay that debt. And if you cannot repay that debt, then you go bankrupt. That's what happened in 1997.